Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to continue our discussion on microevolution today by talking about ways that the inheritance patterns of traits actually helps to ensure, at least in certain situations, the maintenance of genetic variation. So we're going to start first and foremost just talking about the fact that most organisms are diploid, meaning that they carry two alleles for every trait. So really we're talking here about those heterozygote individuals allowing for those recessive alleles to be maintained in the population. And that's the case even if those recessive alleles are useless or even harmful to the individuals who inherit them. So remember that natural selection only really works at a phenotypic level. So if I'm a heterozygote individual, that means I am displaying the dominant phenotype. Well, I can't know just looking at an organism whether they are homozygous dominant or they are heterozygous, because either way their phenotype would be the dominant trait. So there are going to be instances where those heterozygotes happen to find each other. Each parent is heterozygous for that characteristic, so that dominant phenotype presumably is the one that is most adaptive to the environment. Those individual heterozygotes are able to mate with each other, and they will occasionally, statistically, produce recessive offspring that would be less adaptive to their environment as a result. So having this situation benefits overall by keeping that recessive trait in the population, even if it currently isn't as useful, because if that environment shifts and all of a sudden that recessive trait does become more adaptive to the new changing environment, the option is still there. We can also talk about this idea of balancing selection. So this occurs when natural selection maintains stable frequencies of two or more phenotypic forms in a population. It leads to what we talk about as balanced polymorphism, so just the ability of natural selection to maintain that diversity in a population. And there's two instances, two reasons why we sometimes see this balanced polymorphism, and that is this idea of heterozygote advantage as well as frequency-dependent selection. So let's take a look at those. So heterozygote advantage is just the idea that natural selection tends to maintain two or more alleles at the same locus. So locus is the gene's location in your chromosomes. So it tends to maintain that heterozygote because that heterozygote presumably has greater fitness over being homozygous, either dominant or recessive. And the classic example of heterozygote advantage occurs in sickle cell disease and malaria in African populations. So when we look at sickle cell disease, it is a result of a single mutation to a single change in amino acids that causes your red blood cells to sickle, right, or create this C shape. And that can then get passed on genetically. So it's a recessively inherited disease. So individuals who are homozygous recessive would end up having that sickle cell disease and have all the complications that come along with it. So presumably we would assume that natural selection would weed that out of the population at a much greater rate. Being completely homozygous dominant, on the other hand, seems like it should be the best solution, right? You don't have sickle cell disease and you're not passing it on. So we would predict from an evolutionary standpoint that that should be the highest frequency genotype in the population. And we do see really high homozygous dominance, really low homozygous recessives in a lot of populations in the world. But we go to Africa, and we actually don't see that same genotypic distribution. And it becomes a question of why. And what we have figured out is that African populations are very susceptible to malaria, right? Another disease. And individuals who are homozygous recessive, meaning they have the sickle cell disease, seem to have much lower cases of malaria. But they're dying from sickle cell, so still not beneficial as a whole organism. go on the other side of things, and homozygous dominant doesn't have the sickle cell, and yet they are incredibly susceptible to this malaria. So not necessarily great on that side of things either. And what we have found is that heterozygote individuals don't have all the complications of sickle cell and also seem to confer some resistance to malaria. And so natural selection is actually causing more and more heterozygotes to be around than we see on either other end of the spectrum. And it's got to do with this selective pressure from this malaria disease. So although those heterozygotes should theoretically kind of get weeded out of the population because they are making sickle cell babies, potentially, they actually confer this malaria, and so their overall frequency in the population is actually higher than we would expect, and higher than we see in other places in the globe where that malaria isn't a problem. And that's this idea of heterozygote advantage. So there is some stronger advantage to being that heterozygote and potentially producing a less beneficial offspring in that recessive individual than it is to be homozygous dominant and just completely weed out that recessive trait as a whole. Frequency-dependent selection is a similar idea. So it's the fitness of a phenotype that declines if it actually just becomes too common in the population. And so selection just favors, period, whatever phenotype is less common. And we see this a lot in predator-prey interactions. And so if we look at this particular example here with our blue jay, all right, it'll peck on these moth images and receive a food reward. But if the bird does not detect a moth, it pecks on that green circle there in the middle to continue to the next set. So what we ended up seeing is the more that the same phenotype showed up, the more it declined over time. So it was actually more beneficial to be less common in the population. You're less likely to be seen, if you will, and so less likely to get attracted, less likely to attract your predator, I should say, and so you end up surviving and reproducing better than those who are just very common in the population. We've also got this idea of neutral variation. So there are definitely situations where a certain trait, certain allele, doesn't seem to confer any selective advantage at all. And so we could talk about these things called pseudogenes. And this is just a DNA sequence that is similar to a real gene, but doesn't really produce any functional product. So it becomes inactive in this particular species because of mutations. And so those pseudogenes, at least in that interim, don't have any function, and so they don't really confer any benefit or drawback because we're not seeing them at a phenotypic level. And so their relative frequencies aren't affected by natural selection. Any changes we see in them are usually just due to chance. So the question here becomes, well, how may this actually impact the survival or reproduction? Is it something we just can't measure, so we don't think it has anything to do with their selective pressures, anything to do with their fitness? Maybe, maybe not. Or maybe it's just something we haven't figured out how to identify and measure yet. Also, something to think about is that a particular quote-unquote pseudogene in one population, so it's neutral in that situation, may not be in another. So if the environment changes or that organism migrates somewhere else, it is possible that a particular trait, although we're saying it's neutral in this given set of parameters, if I change those parameters, it may now be adaptive or maladaptive depending on the new set of conditions that allele finds itself in as a result of that organism finding itself in a new set of conditions. And then there's sexual selection. So we talk about sexual selection, and really truly it's just natural selection based on mating success. So these tend to result in sexual dimorphism, where we see marked differences between sexes in some sort of set of secondary characteristics. So it has nothing to do with their genitalia. and it's not directly related or associated with their ability to reproduce. So great example are birds, right? We see the females being much more dull in color and much more camouflaged in their environment, and yet these males are these big flashy colors, big flashy feathers, that sort of thing. So when we look at sexual selection, really there's two types. You've got intrasexual selection. This is that direct competition among mates, individuals of the same sex for the opposite sex. And most of the time it's males fighting over females. So having big horns or being bigger and stronger just in general tends to be the case in those males as they fight for the right to mate with the female. We've also got intersexual selection. So with intra, right, it's kind of whoever dominates, whoever wins that competition gets the right to mate with the female. Intersexual selection is really this idea of mate choice, where one gender has some sort of mating behavior or flashy colors or something to attract the other sex. And most of the time, it's the males being these bigger, flashier organisms, or the males who participate in those mating rituals. And then it's the female who ultimately chooses her male based on that set of behaviors or characteristics. And the idea here is, although there's definitely drawbacks to males producing these brightly colored feathers, if we're talking about birds or participating in some ritualistic behavior, it would appear to be maladaptive because it allows them to be more susceptible to identification from their predators. And yet it seems to perpetuate because these females are choosing them based on those characteristics. So there seems to be some sort of connection to being very brightly colored or doing this ritual dance very well in attracting your mate, that female seems to see some sort of advantage, health benefit. They're supposed to be healthier, have better genes, whatever the case might be over evolutionary history, that they choose that male based on that set of characteristics. So possibly it reflects their overall health. And if you think about it, it makes sense for a female to want to choose a male based on a set of characteristics that are reflective of that male's genetics and health, because the female is going to be the one who spends most of the time and energy and resources producing and then potentially caring for that offspring. And so she wants to pick the male that's going to give her offspring the best set of traits to hopefully be as successful as possible.